Good morning, everyone. This is Sanjeeva Singh from Winwire on this webinar. Thank you all for joining in for this session that we are conducting on next-gen app development using Azure. I just want to quickly sort of give you an update on what we're going to cover today in the seminar, webinar, and also give you a quick introduction of the panel members that we have. We're going to walk you through that. We are going to basically look at how Azure can be leveraged for building powerful applications on cloud. I think when we talk to our customers across the board, creating highly available, scalable, mobile-enabled applications in a short time and limited budget is the biggest challenge that we see across. And there's tremendous interest in how, at least for all the Microsoft focused companies who are using Microsoft technology, as to how Azure can be used in these situations. And our entire webinar is going to be focused on how really we can give you an insight into how this can be done. So we'll give you an introduction of entire application development life cycle itself, what are the challenges that we have during the operation life cycle, what are the Azure environment concepts, how do you build and deploy on Azure, and we'll also at the end just give you a demo of the platform management tool itself so that you get a good idea about not only just theoretical concepts behind it, but also how to do it overall. And I'm glad to announce that we have really great attendance overall for this webinar. I'm sure it's going to be very, very useful for all of you to listen to what the topics are being covered in this webinar. For the webinar to be presented, we have Vineet Arora, who's going to be walking us through this entire session. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Winwire, and he's got over 20 years of experience in IT industry. He's Azure Certified Architect, Microsoft VTSP, and actually is a phenomenal resource in terms of his knowledge and depth on Azure platform itself. And Winwire as a company is essentially an IT consulting company. We focus on building custom applications in the mobile-first, cloud-first world. A lot of our application development is happening now with using Azure as a very important component in our development methodology itself, and we will talk about from that our real-world experience as well overall. And we also have the honor of having Stephen from Microsoft in this call, who's leading the entire partner effort on Azure side. And I'll let Steve introduce himself and just address the webinar participants as well. And then we'll pass it on to Vineet to walk us through the session itself.
Great, thank you, Sanjeev. Hey everyone, this is Steve Meyer. I'm the West Region Developer Tools Specialist for Microsoft. A lot of you got the invite from me personally, and I just want to thank you for attending. We're super excited to have Winwire present today, and they're one of our top Azure partners in the West region, and also from a national perspective, they're one of the top ones. So we're very excited to be partnering with them today. My responsibilities are really to support you guys around your Visual Studio, MSDN, anything Team Foundation Server, Visual Studio Online. Azure plays a big role in the application lifecycle. So again, this is Steve Meyer from Microsoft. I just want to thank everyone, and if you want to get a hold of me after the webinar or have questions, I will definitely be following up with all of you. So thank you again for attending. And also on my team is Steve Lang, who give him a quick chance to introduce himself.
Thanks, Steve. So good morning. My name is Steve Lang. I'm a developer technology specialist at Microsoft. I work with the other Steve at Microsoft really to help our customers get the most technical bang for their buck out of an investment in our development tools, our development platform, including Visual Studio, TFS, VSO, Azure, etc. So thank you to all of you who are attending today.
Thank you all. Vineet, over to you.
Sanjeeva and Stephen, everyone, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to anyone who is joining from any other location than the West Coast of US. Good evening to anyone else who is adventurous to still join. Thank you very much for joining. Sanjeev already introduced our company, so I'm not going to spend too much time on introducing Winwire as such, but we'll go ahead and start talking about what is it that we are planning to cover in the webinar today. Oh, okay, that's me, and that's what I look like. Sanjeev already introduced myself. I'm the CTO with Winwire, very passionate about Azure as a platform. As all of you know, probably if you're attending this, you already know the basics of Azure. So I'm not going to be covering basics in any manner, but Microsoft certainly has Azure as a prime focus for the last few months and years, and of course, for the near, viewable future. When we look at Azure, everybody understands the basics, as I said, but what gets missed out is what are the key workloads that can really be leveraged, right, on Azure both as an infrastructure as a service and platform as a service platform. So what I'm looking at covering today, and this is a large topic, it will take probably more than just the 50 minutes that we have available on the call right now. What I'm going to do is give you an introduction to what an Azure-based ALM looks like, right? What does that lifecycle looks like? What are the various tools? What is the dev environment? How should you start thinking about it? And also show you some examples. Again, this is not a level 300 session where I'll be able to actually go into any bit of code. This is more of a level 150, 200 session where I will be able to talk about what are the various components when you start looking at leveraging Azure for your entire application lifecycle maintenance. We'll talk about deployment. We'll also talk about and show you how you can monitor once you get your apps up and running on the Azure platform. So demos is mentioned on the agenda slide as the last point, but I love to sort of mix it up. I will jump over to demos to make it engaging and exciting as I cover some of the topics. All right, so starting with the first topic itself, very clearly, very simply. All right, the slide chooses to start itself. Let me make sure. ALM. I think all of you probably know it. I've just still put it out there. It's the continuous process of managing the life of an application as it's depicted on the diagram out here, from governance to all the way to actual operations of the app. Now, where does Azure fit into this life cycle, right? The boxes that you see highlighted, and that's where we'll be spending a lot more time, is that Azure provides you the infrastructure and the services and all the monitoring capabilities for you to be able to, after you're done with the development of the application, right, able to build, test, deploy, and monitor the application. Now, I am going to cheat a little bit and also, make sure that you also get a little bit of a peek into the whole development aspect, which is going to change, right, not drastically, but a little bit, as you have been used to for building your applications for an on-premises environment. So the development part is also something that I'm going to cover. Why use Azure for application development? I think it's very simple. We should look at 2-3 simple points. One is, of course, global data center, right? Its footprint is across the world. And the reality is that most of the software development happens across time zones in a distributed team. Why not leverage this platform, which gives the performance and the capabilities for the distributed team to still be able to work collaboratively, rather than a development servers and staging servers in one data center, but the teams are accessing it from across the world. Right? And more importantly, as you have heard already about a journal impression about, not impression, the general sense about the cloud usage is pay as you go. Right? You're not doing development 24 hours a day. It's not a website that you're hosting and you're running. You're doing development for whatever is your 12 hours, 14 hours, maybe 8 hours if you are a good developer. You get to go home after that, but you pay only for what you are using those services for. More importantly, there are options available. And as we start over the next few slides, these are the ones that we'll explore. You already know what virtual machines are, what probably websites and cloud services are. How do they play into the dev environment, the whole application lifecycle maintenance in the Azure environment. And more than that, it's not just an environment where you can deploy your applications. You also have a lot of other services that are being made available, which you can build your applications around. So it's just not deploying websites with few functionalities. You can actually have enterprise-grade applications deployed and leveraging these services, which you do not need to really worry about. You do not need to talk about it. And when I start talking about not worrying about, I'll just show you one slide, not need to go into too much of details. This is just the tip of the iceberg on the number of services that Azure as a platform contains. I just wanted to display from an app services perspective, from a data perspective and infrastructure perspective, the entire layer of what you would need is covered in the Azure as a platform. What we're going to focus on is just some of the app services for this part of the discussion. And this is a variation of a slide that I'm sure many of you have seen. If you are a developer, if you have been even designing applications, you're very familiar with the stack shown on the left side of the slide. That's your data center. You have a bunch of servers. Your IT has provisioned those servers, and you have to take care of everything from making sure the hardware is properly configured, of course, you as in your organization or somebody in your team, right? And all aspects of virtualization, all the way to firewall settings, databases, and of course, the applications. When you start looking at Azure as an environment, these are the three options, and which are reducing the complexity that is to be worried by you, but focused more on the application itself. You do have virtual machines where you will still need to worry about operating system upwards in the stack, but you don't care about the hardware. You don't really care about how the virtualization happens. And if you choose cloud services as the option where you will deploy your app on Azure, right, you don't even need to worry about the operating system configurations. You only worry about the various stacks of the application itself. And then if you choose to have a website as the option, right, and this is a particular service in Azure, you only need to worry about the application and the data. And because of the time, that's one of the quick demos that I'll show you, how quickly you can get a full-fledged ASP.NET MVC site up and running without really worrying about where do I host it, what configuration do I need to make. That's the power of Azure's development as an option. But let's certainly talk about what are these options entail. I'm not going to go through each of these slides. Some of these slides are going to be available to you after this session. You will be able to read it at your own leisure. Virtual machines, as you already know, are nothing but what you use, similar to what you use in your data center, virtualized environments for a full-fledged Windows, or even in certain cases, you may need Linux or any other operating systems. That is also possible on the Azure platform. Websites are environments, not just your HTML website, but ASP.NET websites. But then you also have now options for a variety of different languages on which you can build code and then deploy it in this website infrastructure. This includes PHP, Python, Ruby on Rails, all sorts of technologies. Cloud services is the environment where you can actually have services running, everything from just simple web services to much more complex services, background processes that you may want to manage and scale as the need be. Something that I did not show you earlier, and certainly no enterprise application today is complete without having a mobility interface. Azure also provides a mobile service that allows the similar functionality that you are deploying on various other options to also provide you a development option to build mobile applications as a part of your overall enterprise application design. As I said, I'm not going to spend too much time just graphically representing. This is what you live with or have lived with. I have lived with this environment for many, many years. You have an IT admin who will provision all the environment for you. This includes everything from dev, test, and even production, ultimately, which you don't have access to, of course. That's why it's not shown out here. But you, as the development team, use the virtual machines. You have your own desktops or laptops. You have your own dev environment, and then you leverage that. It's a very simple work. I'm not sort of double-clicking on this. However, there are challenges in this, right? How much virtual machines do you need? How much of resource contention is happening? You are starting a build, and it hogs a lot of RAM and the processing power, and then other people's performance gets impacted of the development environment. So these are the reality, because how much scale can the development environment be given? More importance is always given to the production environment. When you look at in an Azure environment, what changes, right? The picture is almost similar, right? It's flipped, yeah, but you see this text that I have highlighted? You as the developers also have the capabilities under, of course, a set of constraints that your IT admin will define to provision VMs that help you scale your development. You may want to add a developer for, let's say, 5 days of some module to be developed, right? If you have to wait for 10 days for that person to get those access, it's futile. It's going to impact the overall replanning that you're doing. But the ability for you to be, as a development team, to be able to manage and control your development environment, enhance it, scale it up, scale it down, and let still the IT admins manage that environment is just phenomenal. And this is just from a virtual machine perspective, as we talk about other services and the control that you'll be able to have even on, for example, testing, right? How many test environments do you need to run? How many test instances do you need to run? What kind of a test server should you have? Do you need to procure that, or for the 1 hour that you need to run the test, could the website suddenly be leveraging those high number of CPUs and high number of RAM? That's what is the capability that is available in this particular environment. There are always images of virtual machine that I'll show you as an example that are available to you, but you may have been a very mature development organization. You may have already got images created which you roll out to your new developers that are getting added to the team. You can absolutely also upload and leverage the same ones out here and still leverage the whole scalability that the platform provides. Quickly touching again on Azure mobile services, the idea is for you to be able to leverage the mobile development tool and environment that you choose. Everything from Visual Studio, which is of course being used for building good mobile applications, but there are Xcode, Eclipse, all of those could also be the potential tools that can ultimately leverage these backend services, right, that Azure provides about data storage, authentication, push notification, which are very, very, some of them are very unique to the mobile application development. So those are services which are again available, makes your development effort and life very easy. Let's make one thing clear, and this is something, and this is also something that has again changed. There is something in between. All of you must have, if you have been a Microsoft developer for some time, Visual Studio as an option. Right? Visual Studio is certainly the dev tool that I have lived with, I have grown with for the last 15 years, 12 years to be precise, and then it used to be some other various tools. It still is there, and it's continuing to be enhanced every year or 2 years with more and more richer features to build a variety of applications. In the SaaS mindset of environment, Microsoft also released what is called Visual Studio Online, and this is the cloud service that also allows you to collaboratively work with a larger team and not really need to have a desktop application if you're building some of those. And again, I just want to put these options out there because there are advantages of both, right? And there are needs for both of them that you will be able to use. Now, what Visual Studio Online is certainly providing is also your code repository, your collaborative environment when you have distributed team, and it is leveraging Azure as an environment to host your code. So this is your TFS in the cloud, not the TFS which you will have it on your data center, but that's where your code repository, that's where your documentation, that's where your bugs tracking, that's where your reports could all reside. That's where Visual Studio Online is evolving. You could still leverage your standard Visual Studio connected to the TFS on-premises or the TFS which is on the cloud. All the options are still available to you. When you look at developing, testing, and then running the apps in Azure, these are the few sort of guidelines or steps that I want to talk about. You, of course, start by writing the code, right? That's always a good place to start. Of course, you should design the code before you write the code, so don't forget that. However, once you have designed the code and you thought about it, you use, of course, Visual Studio as one of the tools. But you can certainly use Eclipse. You can certainly use other dev environments that are available. Nothing stops you from doing that while you still want to use Azure as the final deployment ground for your application. As I said, you will normally do everything that you will do, create a new app, and I will show you a demo where you will see what changes for you when you want to actually not worry about your data center, but Azure as a place where your application should be developed, should be tested, and then finally even should be for production deployed out there. So you can test the code. If you have used Azure SDK, and if you have not, that's fine. Along with Visual Studio is an Azure SDK that provides an emulator. So just in case if you're still on the laptop and you do not want to have the effort of putting everything really on an Azure cloud, you do have sort of a very emulation of that Azure environment with limitations, of course. So you can quickly test everything is working, but ultimately you will need to deploy it into a cloud service or a website or a virtual machine on an Azure subscription that we'll talk about to ultimately test the application. You will deploy using very familiar tools. Visual Studio makes it much more simpler. I'll show you a quick demo of that. And of course, there are command line tools that have existed for the longest time to deploy to servers. Similar command lines and PowerShell commands are available to deploy even to the Azure environment. After the application is deployed, it's very important for not only you as a developer, but your dev managers, for people who are testing the application, who are managing the application. How can they actually look at updating the application, release management, for example, right? In-place updates like you've done is still going to be possible, but what is the very interesting option available is, as we'll talk about the development environment, is you can actually leverage this very interesting concept where you can have 2 copies of the application running. You update one of them, but which is not in production, which is more of a staging, right? You test it, make sure everything is working fine, right? And then you do not need to really deploy it, but you just swap the IP addresses from what is in production to point to this particular app that you just tested and everything is working fine. And within a few seconds, your new application with all the new functionality is live on the same IP address, on the same DNS mapping. That's what VIP, that's a virtual IP swap that you do. And it's a very easy way to deploy the code rather than copying the code and deploying all the functionalities. Monitoring aspects, we'll show a quick demo of that if you have time. But if you have ever used Azure environment, it has been growing every week. I see something very interesting coming in. The amount of monitoring and tracking and kind of logging, the visual representation of how your app is performing is just phenomenal on the entire dashboard. And of course, you have System Center. Some of you may be IT folks who are aware of what System Center is. That's a phenomenal product from Microsoft that allows you to manage not just your app, but the entire environment around the app. And it's no different for the apps that you will deploy in Azure environment. System Center will still be able to manage both your on-premises and the apps that you deployed on the cloud environment. I'm quickly showing you some screenshots. I always keep them as a backup just in case something goes wrong. in terms of demo. This is, if you've been building Visual Studio, very familiar tool and UI for you. You will see this option now called Cloud out here. And that cloud means there are application types that you can choose. You want to build an ASP.NET web application, or maybe run a job, or as you remember, mobile service, right? You can choose any of those, and once you choose those, then you again have these various ways of programming. So MVC being one, web forms the traditional way, or the single page application, which has become very popular. And then you will see this very interesting option. You can choose to not host in cloud, but you can also leave that option on, host it in cloud, and then you can still choose, do you want to host it as a website? Remember the diagram where you will then only need to worry about the data and the application, where it gets hosted, how does it get configured, where is the IIS? Nobody needs to worry about that. You certainly don't need to worry about that, and all the configurations will be taken care when you finally deploy the application. So I'll quickly switch over to Visual Studio for a quick few seconds. This is a sample application that I have opened. I just want to show you, if you have Visual Studio, this is Visual Studio Premium Desktop Edition, and you can create a new project. As I showed you, you have the cloud option. You, of course, have all the other traditional options. You can choose an ASP.NET web application. Let's give it a name, Demo App. And remember, I have Visual Studio on out here. It is connected to my Azure subscription. What that means is that it knows what is the configuration and everything of my Azure subscription. It will normally take a lot of time. That's why I have it already. You will see it out here. That's me, and then it's making me choose which Azure subscription do I want to actually deploy it to. I'll choose my actually MSDN subscription, and that's the one that I have. Let's call it Demo App. Then go ahead with it. Again, I get a choice of MVC or Web API. I leave it as MVC, and I leave it as also website, which is the option, right? And I will just go ahead and deploy. What this is doing is it's creating a traditional application. To create your solution, it'll create, of course, also all the related configurations. But look here, what it's trying to do now. It's trying to ask you to say, okay, are you sure where do you want to deploy it? Maybe this website you want to run it in some other part of the world, right? Sitting here, I can choose. Remember the whole point that I said, why deploy it on Azure? I can say this web app, I'm maybe making it for East Asia, right? And I may have an existing database server in East Asia that I want to use. I'll choose that, and I can choose the password for that. This one I don't remember. I'll choose the one for which I remember for this demo. And that's it. What this is doing is Visual Studio is now intelligent enough not to just to create the solution and the project, but create all the configurations that ultimately will take this app and then actually deploy it right to Azure as a website. You really don't need to worry about it. Of course, you will do all the standard development that you will do out here. It's the connection back to the Azure that makes it very simple. Once this thing completes, I'll probably go to the Azure environment and show you, but you'll also see the publishing settings and the amount of configuration control that you have as a developer without really relying upon anyone. Here it is. So the application is created. We'll talk about the packaging, but once I have this, right now I have not published this application. If I want to publish this application, and I'm jumping the demo in the interest of time, but this is a demo that I wanted to show you later. Here is all the configurations where I want to deploy it. I can choose to deploy it as a website. I could also go ahead and make it into a virtual machine, maybe a virtual machine that already has some pre-configured third-party components and all the settings that I need. They are already there, and I may need to, with IIS configuration already done, which is standard to my application environment. I may want to deploy it to that environment, then I will choose virtual machine. You look at all the connections, settings, you look at everything else, how will the application look, right? And then you can just go ahead and publish it. So while this is publishing, as you will see, it's taking all the configurations, it's taking just the default set of files, default set of UI that has been created, and publishing all of this into Azure. I don't care about where the IIS is, and it will just open that UI for me. It has created the DNS, demo app 876 Azure websites.net, and boom, here is my website. Hoping that it's getting refreshed on your screen. I know it takes a few seconds sometimes. And the website is all up and running. I have not written a single line of code, but this is running on Azure. And to show you that, I'll go back to my websites, and you will see that app that I just created just got added in the list of websites that I have. Right? I'll leave it at this, and I'll come back to this after a few slides that I've shown. Of course, this was a screenshot that was taken when you are not logged into Azure. So if you're not logged into Azure, it'll ask you to log in so that you can publish and it'll gather all the information about your Azure subscription. Visual Studio Online, this is a free Visual Studio that is available to you. There is also another free Visual Studio that has been recently announced. I'll not talk much about that. Maybe Steven can touch upon that at the end. But this is the one where you have Team Foundation Server and a lot of collaboration around your dev environment, right, available to you, on the web. It's a SaaS solution. You really don't need much of, desktop application except Visual Studio, of course, which you will need once you've configured everything out there, once you have all the tracking happening out there. That's where your code repository resides. When you sign up for it, you get 5 free users, and you can always add more users. Sanjeeva just confirming I'm still online. If you can please acknowledge.
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to cover this slide for a few seconds. This is the point that I wanted to show. Some of the organizations which may be slightly smaller in size may be able to leverage Visual Studio Online as a phenomenal environment to host and build before they actually upgrade and migrate to a full-fledged enterprise tool, so that you feel comfortable with the entire environment. You will still use Visual Studio Online with Azure, right, because that's your code repository, but it's not necessary that you need to use TFS itself. The way Microsoft is designing is that you could also use Git, for example, as your source control in this case. But that's the environment that lets you integrate with Azure in a seamless fashion, so that all your applications, all your development environments can be, all your teams can be all together in one environment. I already showed you the demo for the Visual Studio, so I'll skip this slide. Let's just quickly cover when you have to start thinking about it. Right? Remember that red text that you saw on the slide where you can provision the VMs. How should you be thinking and designing about it rather than relying on an IT environment who gives you, these are the 2 servers, and these are the 2 servers for staging and test, and this is it. Now you cannot do anything. Now you go ahead and deploy it. This may take a little bit to absorb, but just catch up on a couple of items. Once you're very familiar with Azure as an environment, there is a hierarchy of these this terms that you'll need to sort of be aware of. There's a billing. There's a whole Azure subscription that you make. There are services within a particular subscription. You do deployment in either production or staging. Remember the virtual IP swap that I talked about? That's why you need the production and the staging. And then you have a role, which is a rep or a worker role. And some of those are so basic I'm not covering on this one, but we'll be happy to point you to the right place where you can get those ideas. And of course, a virtual machine is running instance. Very simple graphical representation, no rocket science. You should have a dev environment where you have, on the Azure subscription, where you can have a dev subscription and a test subscription. Within that, you can create various services. Each service has a staging and a production deployment. The reason it is depicted like this is isolation, scaling, also from a management perspective that you need to do is very easy, right? So the staging and production within a particular service in the dev environment itself is for your deployment, right, your updates itself. It's not the dev to test to production deployment. That's a little bit of a change that you need to get used to. And whoever is finally going to be paying the bill for running that app, running the system, should of course have a operations billing account where you're ultimately going to be really getting the bill for not only the external usage but also the scale for which you need, right? Because the development environment, of course, you're still subscribing to an Azure subscription where you're paying, but you are doing a lot of scaling up and scaling down as per your need. Whereas operations is where you are finally deploying your application, and your scaling up and scaling down will be defined more by the actual usage of your application rather than more of a dev environment. Deployment. I think I showed you a peek into the deployment options itself. Unlike MSI packages, that used to be created, or ASP.NET websites just being packaged. In case of Azure, you create what is called a .cspkg. That's a file that is an encrypted file, which you could probably create on your own and then take it and deploy it on Azure, or let Visual Studio do all the jobs for you, right, and which I just showed you, and I'll go back in a minute and show you some of the other options. Of course, as I said, there are command line options that can help you package your entire solution and deploy it into the Azure environment, right, again from your desktop. Of course, the easiest approach is do the automation build, right? Be careful you're deploying it into a cloud environment, right? Unless and until you have a virtual machine which will have all the capabilities of the global assembly cache. If you're choosing website or services, right, your application has to be as much self-contained as possible. I would say entirely self-contained, because there is no global environment. So going back for a second to the publishing that I showed you, and let's just look at this. And let me just switch over to a second. I'm going to open the previous one just to make sure that I have. All right. So you saw the same options, all the connections and everything else. This is when you want to deploy, the publishing method is web deploy. You could also say web deploy using a package. In that case, none of those configurations really need to be known. It will actually output a zip file, which is of course all the files and the CS package all combined into one. You could also do FTP. You could also deploy it on the local file system and then take it and then package it, maybe email it, maybe send it whatever way to somebody else to finally deploy it. These are mechanics which are still required sometimes. You may or may not have direct access to the Azure environment, but I just wanted to let you know that this is of course going to be the easiest and the most straightforward fashion. This is the URL which you saw for that particular application, and you have all the connection settings and everything else that you have supplied out here. Very much used to, if you have been doing over the last few years, how Visual Studio has provided it for deploying even in your data center. But this is certainly not a server. This is more of a website that you're deploying in this particular case. So we already looked at this. So you have the test or the production deployment. You can use PowerShell scripts. You can also, if you're using some of the automations, make them as builds. So if you're using, for example, Visual Studio Online, you will have options to be able to automate those builds, every nightly build that can be deployed into the Azure environment. That all is very, very much possible to be automated. There are certain configuration aspects. Remember, this is an environment which you do not normally have access to the servers. So the code that you're deploying, the configuration and the security will be defined using certificates. so that you're just not able to deploy any kind of a code, and anybody cannot deploy it to your environment, even if they have even if they are part of the dev team. So there are certifications around that. I just showed you these options. You could import a configuration from somewhere else. You could directly publish to a website, or you could publish it to a virtual machine. Same screenshot that I showed you. I just wanted to make sure that we talk about that. Now, going back to the entire ALM lifecycle, now you've deployed this application. Now you have tested this application. Everything is working fine, right? You ultimately make the deployment into your production environment. How do you monitor it, right? You have known about instrumentation, right? You will look at, your IT team will manage the application and monitor the application. Because it is running in an environment where you may not have a lot of control to the bottom stack of the entire configuration that we talked about, Azure does provide on its own various functionalities for you to monitor all the aspects of how the app is running, how the resources are being consumed by the app, right? And you can still use some of the standard tools like the System Center Operations Manager, which is again an IT tool that could still give you a lot of reports. Now, as Microsoft knows, System Center is certainly a phenomenal product and is deployed by many organizations. As you as developers are starting to deploy your applications, you may or may not have an instant access to that System Center dashboards, because your IT team manages that. So what I want to show you is, if you have deployed a particular app, how you will still be able to monitor the functionality, the performance of your app, right, and be able to, without really depending on somebody else, right, in real time see how your app is performing. You could also have your SQL being managed, right, and there are tools for that also. Let me jump back to the UI that I was showing you. This is the Azure Management UI. This is where Vinway's own, where I have deployed a bunch of virtual machines and websites. Remember, this is the one, and this is the one that we created. This is the one that I was showing you as a sample. If I actually click on it, in the UI, in the browser itself, I have options to actually even stop this particular service. So I've deployed this website. I don't have IIS access, right? I'm not going and doing an IIS reset or shutting down IIS, but I have a simple stop, restart, which is as good as IIS reset, or maybe even delete it, right, if you want it. You also have dashboard. What the dashboard is providing is one aspect of the monitoring, right? Phenomenal. How is the CPU being used? Right? Which CPU? Means you really don't know, because you don't know about what is the kind of a server on which it's running. But wait, we have some configuration still accessible on that, but you at least know how much of time of the CPU, what kind of a data in, data out, if there were any HTTP errors, and how many requests came in. And I have not made many requests to this particular website. That's why the graph is very small. You could also, remember we talked about, right, really control how much power. Let's say now you need to test this web application. You need to load test it, or you need to just test out how will it work if I were to have this running on a lower RAM or a higher RAM, right? This is where the beauty of the management interface comes in. Very simple to use. You can choose free, which is of course what is chosen already for you. What that means is your application is running only as one instance, right? This is all without changing anything, right? Can you change it? Of course not, because it's free. You can say share, right? You can also choose basic, and I'm not going to go into each one of them in detail, but very quickly you can see as soon as you choose basic, you have some options in terms of the kind of RAM and the kind of cores that you can use. Maybe I want to use large, right? And I can choose 7 GB of RAM, right? And when I choose standard, that's where I actually have the most control on, right, what I want to choose, how many CPUs do I want to track, and then maybe even include the instances of how many real instances of this service will be running, right? There is this whole load balancing concept and all some of the IT concepts that I'm not going to cover on this session, but we'll be happy to cover those. That's the kind of a control that you have without worrying about going into any Windows environment, running any scripts, or asking for this to increase. So you could make it to this, run the application for that amount of time, come back, reduce the number of instances, right? That's it. So you're really not paying for that much of power if you don't really need it. So I just wanted to show you that while you are mostly tracking from a dev perspective, these kinds of controls are very interesting for you as a developer who has more control on how do you want to scale your application for your testing in an environment. Right? You have backups. You're also doing backups of your code. Remember how many times you've lost your code? This is an interesting one where you could actually back up your entire website and everything code so that there is a historical backup available to you just in case something goes wrong. That's, again, all inbuilt. So I talked about monitoring. I talked about the elasticity that the application provides. Right, this is where as you monitor and you see it's running slow, it's using a lot of CPU time. Maybe you want to go ahead and increase that CPU and then see how the experience goes. So this all you can do during your dev and test itself before it even goes into production. And of course, once it goes into production, there are lots of other techniques and mechanics that are used to make sure that the application is performing well. You can scale the environment and then bring back the performance metrics into your dev and see, okay, what's going wrong? Maybe I need to look at the logs and see where my application is not really performing. So I showed you the Azure data services. What I want to start wrapping up with is we talked about using your standard dev environment, your standard mechanics to publish, right? You will certainly be using a database. You could use an on-prem database, or you could use a Azure-based database. Your dev and coding does not really change much. However, once your application is running in Azure, you also have access to, of course, if you have subscribed to them, you also have access to a set of services that really expand the capabilities of your entire solution, right? You have media services which will allow you to build complete media storage, media encoding, conversion, all the media content that you may need to build into your solution. You also have things like service bus, which you're, of course, very much aware of. Anybody remembers MSMQ? Those kinds of things, from the old age. Of course, service bus is much more traditional term. That messaging infrastructure is built into Azure. Now, it should be very apparent. Why is it required? Because you're not deploying it on a Windows Server environment that you're used to having so many services. These are the services that are part and parcel of Azure as an environment. That's why it's also sometimes called the Cloud OS, right? It's the entire operating system available on the cloud for you to deploy your applications. How you leverage these services is, of course, slightly different than how you would have leveraged if you were to deploy it on a Windows on-prem, which is, of course, the traditional way. So there's enough documentation to how to leverage Service Bus or use Notification Hub to make sure that your application can send out notifications, or to automate the entire creation and management of the resources, scheduler services, many of these services that are part and parcel of the Azure as an environment where you're ultimately deploying your application. I'm going to stop here and make sure that the rest of the time that is available for what we have covered, right, I can answer any questions. As you can see, it is certainly a very large topic, and I've tried to give you a quick introduction into the aspects of ALM that Azure provides. Each of the topic can itself take probably an hour to go dive, do a deep dive and cover into detail. Would be happy to follow up with anyone if you're interested to know more about it. But certainly in the last few minutes that are available, would be happy to answer any questions. Here are some of the contact details that you can note to keep in touch with us and all the happenings that are happening at Winmire in terms of the various technical blogs that we publish or the various contact that you may want to have for information about our future webinars.
Thanks, Vineet. Thanks for the wonderful sessions. I do have a few questions for you, Vineet. The first and foremost is, do we have Azure monitoring tools included in the service? That's the first question coming from the audience.
So some of the basic tools that I showed to you, some of the dashboards are part and parcel of the Azure environment itself. Microsoft is currently working on, and it's already released, a lot of advanced tools to monitor the health of your application. And then there are third-party ISVs that are building tools, for monitoring. System Center, just to be clear, is of course the Microsoft flagship product to manage environment like this or your on-prem environment. That is a separate product. That does not come with Azure per se. It's a product that allows you to manage and monitor a wide variety of your infrastructure and apps, but it can also monitor Azure.
Thanks, Vineet. So I have other questions. The second question is, in order to build a server, we do need TFS admin console. If that is the case, do we need a license for that?
Making sure I understand the question right. So in Visual Studio Online, and let me see if it works and I can show you a quick demo of that. In Visual Studio Online, you really do not need anything around that. Okay, so here is Visual Studio Online, where I can actually create, right, my TFS and all the other environment. Right? This is just a very different way of working. So I could create, let's say, www.demo, and if I create this account.
We're still seeing the slide.
Oops, sorry.
Yep, we can see now.
And I don't think it was captured, but I did say in the IM window, if you have MSDN, Visual Studio Online is free as well. So yes, we do have a free version that's for up to 5 users, but if you have an MSDN subscription, VSO is free as well.
Okay, thank you, Steven. So yes, so this is what you see out here. This is the option where you have used Visual Studio Online. I just created www.demo.visualstudio.com. I can create a project out here. I can choose Team Foundation or Git as a source control, and you really don't need to worry about the back-end mechanics of this. This is what the beauty is. So let's just go ahead and create maybe a demo app. And you have the same Agile or your Scrum mode. I'll just go ahead with the Scrum for now. And what this does is it creates all the backend environment, your source control, your tracking, your portal that ultimately will become your team portal, right, online for you to be able to work in a collaborative environment, right? This is where you manage even your sprints information, right? And you could use Visual Studio or you could use Xcode or something. So this is the entire environment that I've created. This is Visual Studio Online, right, where you can actually look at the code. This is your hierarchy, right, in your source control, right? So the way you have worked with TFS in the past is slightly different if you're working this in the SaaS model, right? And then you have your entire work schedule, your builds. All of those are, of course, managed out here. For Sprint 1, this is where you could actually track and manage all your user stories, all your work items that you're used to in your traditional TFS environment. So I know I went a little bit of a demo-based answer, but hopefully this answered the aspect that you're looking at.
Thanks, Vineet. So here's the question.
One more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So what tools do I need in order to build apps for Azure?
So that's a good question. So very simply, I think I've been talking about that. Visual Studio is still, the choice of where you will be building the application. What you will, of course, need along with Visual Studio is the Azure SDK. That is, if you're, for example, using Visual Studio on the previous version, now it's getting part and parcel of the entire development and setup. You can choose to have the Azure SDK installed when you're deploying the packages and Visual Studio, and that's the only thing that you need. All those features and functionalities to connect to the Azure environment in the traditional desktop environment is part and parcel of the Visual Studio setup. If you're using Visual Studio Online, which is what I'm showing you right now, you probably just need a browser, right, for doing most of this interaction. But then when you are doing some of the other coding, you'll of course need the Visual Studio as the desktop environment also, maybe the Express version, maybe the Premium, and if you're really lucky, the Ultimate version, which has all the bells and whistles.
Thanks, Vinit. Thanks for that. Steven, I have a question for you. Could you please elaborate a little bit more in terms of pricing or the costing on the Azure services?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi. So there's really three ways to purchase Azure, and it really kind of depends on how much of it and what workloads you need. But there's pay-as-you-go, and then there's a monetary commit, and then the third option is an EA commitment or an enterprise agreement. For pay-as-you-go, really it's somebody that's just getting started with Azure. You want to handle some on-demand or short-term computing requirements. It might be a seasonal situation, but there's zero upfront cost on online pay-as-you-go, and it just, you can either choose credit card or invoicing. The second is an online monetary commitment, and really that's for sort of a broader need across the platform. You have some steady monthly usage or projected growth, and you start, it's a startup sometimes or in this online monetary commitment mode where there is some regular compute and storage and database. A mid-sized business app might be in that scenario. For the requirements there, it's monthly billing. You're willing to commit to 6 to 12 months of service in this option, and it's billed via credit card or invoice, and you do begin to start getting a discount above and beyond the pay-as-you-go. And then the third is enterprise agreement. So this is for, again, broad needs across the platform. You do have year-over-year cloud growth. You have a fairly significant predictable annual spend, and you will get bigger, larger discounts on the services. Some scenarios for the EA commitment: you're migrating an application to the cloud, you're migrating your entire infrastructure or test dev infrastructure to the cloud, medium-sized, large projects, and in terms of how that is paid, and that is you can either do an upfront payment. Really, that one's a little bit more flexible in terms of your payment structure. It's invoiced out, and it's an annual sort of agreement option. So depending on, again, how much you commit to, really dictates your discount level. And again, you can always contact the team here for more questions specifically to your organization and what discount levels they apply to.
Thanks, Steven. That's very informative answer. So here is, I have last question. This is for you, Vinit, again. What is WinWire's role in leveraging Microsoft Azure?
Okay, very, very good question. So I can probably go to the first slide and maybe even have Sanjeeva talk about it. We are a Microsoft managed partner. What that means is that we have these skills and the capabilities when you are looking at designing and developing applications for your Azure environment. We can do everything from advisory consulting on how do you want to plan and design leveraging Azure for your dev environment, test environment, production environment, or the other services, right? Not just the dev and test. There are other services that I've not even touched upon, storage, and other functionalities. For a DR scenario, you may be looking at the Azure. We provide all those advisory services. Then we also provide capabilities that you may need to ramp up your team to say, let's take up this particular project, and we have these folks who know how the application works, but they don't know Azure, and work with us to actually migrate that app to Azure as an environment, leverage its services, re-engineer the application, do what we call as a legacy modernization into the new gen way of deploying, managing, and monitoring those applications. And then, of course, last but not the least is once you have it running, WinWire also has the services available to you to monitor and manage those apps that are running on a regular basis and do proactive maintenance on making sure that the apps are running. Sanjeev, I'm not sure if you want to add anything from your side. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Vinit. I think Sanjeeva has left, that's good. So I have a last question. I think this is again mostly for you. So if I would be using Azure for development and production, would be on premises, is there anything that I should be watching for?
I'm not sure I got the question clearly. Noor, what is it about on-premises that is being asked?
That's right. I'll just repeat the question. If I would be using Azure for development and production, is there anything that I should be watching out for?
I mean, well, there are lots of things that we talked about that you will need to be watching out for, and that's where our advisory services comes in. We'll need to understand what kind of a team structure you have, what kind of what is the best way to configure your dev and test environment. How should you utilize your Azure subscription, but how should you also structure your team, and what is the setup that you will need on your desktop environment? I mean, it's a very broad question to say what do you watch out for. Your approach is similar as to what is there from an on-prem, that you have dev environment, you have dev laptops and desktops, and you have servers where you're doing your dev environment, but the way you configure those are certainly the ones that you will need to watch. Practices that the engaged customers can provide that information, and we'll be happy to provide that to anyone who is looking for that.
Thanks, Vinit. Thanks, Stephen, for taking up those questions. I know we are already ahead of the time. So,
I did want to make one last note. This is Steve Meyer again from Microsoft. We will be doing a drawing for the $350 gift card to the Microsoft Store, and we'll send out the winner, via email and contact them and let everybody know. And again, if you have follow-up questions or asks from our team, please do not hesitate to reach out to me at smeyer@microsoft.com. That's SMEYER@microsoft.com.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Vinit. And thanks, everyone, for joining this session. I hope you find this very informative. Have a good day.
Thank you, WinWire. Nice job.